This day in Tennessee sports history is about Pat Summitt. She passed away 8 years ago today. How many rings would Pat Summitt have won if she didn't get ill?
I'm going to say, and this is going to be controversial, but I'm going to say 2. I'm going to say 2.
That would give her 9 total?
10. That would give her 10.
Okay. I don't think that's controversial. Why do you think that's controversial? Because 2 in 8 years is pretty good.
Yeah, but so after Pat Summitt had to step down, UConn won 5, including 4 in a row. So there's the idea that they wouldn't do that if Pat Summitt wasn't there.
But don't you think she would have won? Don't you think she would have pulled some of those recruits that won champion, at least 1 or 2?
This is where it's hard for me to say. This is where it's hard for me to say. And look, the reason Pat Summitt didn't get a national title out of her last 4 years is probably because of her dementia. I think it cost her in coaching in a couple of those tournaments. I think she could have gotten 1 even during the Maya Moore era. I do think that.
I was told people started to see signs. You're right. I was told people started to see signs 4 and 5 years from her actually stepping aside.
Yeah, I had heard that too. The problem is that Pat Summitt, as great as she was at building women's basketball in general, she was very archaic in many of her philosophies. And I can point to just why she canceled the series with UConn. She didn't like that UConn was using ESPN as a locational advantage. She thought that was unfair and unethical to use the ESPN studios as an advantage for them to recruit.
And it was a violation, for the record.
It was a violation, but it was a secondary violation. And Dave, secondary violations, coaches do them all the time for advantages because you'd rather get the secondary violation and get the player. And
yeah, but you'll never hear me say this about any other coach. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Pat Summitt would pass on the player for a secondary violation.
I know she would. She would.
So you're saying that she wouldn't bend the rules enough in today's day and age because she was so by the book?
Yes. And I think that was costing her. And by the way, that was costing her all the way back in 2000. That's why Candace Parker was the only transcendent recruit she got after Shamika Holtzclaw and Tamika Catchings. Candace Parker was the only one. She kept losing to Gina Oriema on these recruits. And I think it became a problem. And I think she was so by the book that it would have ended up costing her. She still would have she's Pat Summitt. So just her name alone is going to get top-notch recruits. Right. You know what I mean? So, and she knows how to coach. She could have developed and adjusted, but her X's and O scheme, what I'm saying, but I just don't think she would have ever. I can't sit there and say that if she's around, she lands Brianna Stewart, or if she lands Aja Wilson or Aaliyah Boston, or these superstars that are going to South Carolina right now. I can't say that she was ever going to land them because I think she wasn't willing to use unfair advantages. I'm not saying, I don't know if Dawn Staley's ever committed secondary violation. She may not have, but I do think that I think all coaches are willing to do a little bit more than Pat Summitt was willing to do to win a national title at that point. And I think being so by the book with the women's basketball game developing so much more parity was not sustainable long-term to win a national title.
That's the other thing that you mentioned in passing that I think we need to be sure and point out. Winning 2 out of 8 is probably analogous in this day and age, let's say over the last 8 years, to winning 6 out of 8 in the 90s. I mean,
yes.
There's just so much more parity. It was going to be so much more difficult to win. I don't have a problem with 2. I mean, I don't even think that's really controversial, Caleb. I think 2 is a good number because of the way the game has changed. So I would take 3 or 4 even, me personally, but I can't say that
that's crazy
that you think it's 2. I don't not at all.
And I want to address one thing because actually Kyle made a good point. And I'm just going to share the comment real quick because he said she would have changed with the times just like Rick Barnes because she's a great coach. Now, there's a lot of talk, maybe, and this is why it's so unfair to bring this up because she passed away before we could ever see. Maybe she would have pulled a Nick Saban, which is fought against, this type of recruiting, fought against it, and accepted it and said, you know what, I'm going to have to do it. It's very possible she could have done that because Nick Saban fought against the changing offense, and he said, you know what, I'm going to have to do it. And that's a great point with Rick Barnes. Dave, how long were we saying Rick Barnes needs to get away from this philosophy he has? It's killing him in the tournament. And he stubbornly stuck to it until last year when he's like, I want to get a national title. And he revamped everything. Maybe she would have done that, but she was very, very principled and very, very proud of the way she built Tennessee.
I don't think she would have done that. I don't think she would have changed anything drastically in terms of how she handled recruiting and potentially towing the line or stepping across the line in recruiting. Now, it is worth noting she would be 72. So this would be her late 60s that she would be winning these mythical championships that we're discussing. So, I mean, age would have been a factor, but I'll say this, being around Pat Summitt as many times as I was, she was a person who seemed 15 years younger than she was. I'm actually surprised when I Googled it and she would have been 72 now. I would have guessed like 64 because she just seemed so much younger than she was.
I covered a couple of practices. She had more energy than all her players.
She did. Actually. She did. And I've said it before. You could sell tickets to those practices, could you not?
You could.
So entertaining.
It was Pat Summitt was there are those type of coaches that you are just scared of as a player. And you feared Pat Summitt when
so
you
were. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you feared her. You feared her in a good way, by the way. In a good way. She was. I mean, that is like that stare thing. Wasn't like that was real. If you ever covered her practices, she gave me the stare, Dave, because I went to do an interview with Sydney Spencer. I didn't know I was a freshman at UT, so I didn't know the protocols of like calling the SID to get interviews and stuff. So I just walked into a practice onto the court one day, and I'm like, "Hey, Coach Summitt, can I speak to Sydney Spencer?" And she was kind of confused because she didn't know the protocol. She's like, "Whatever." And then like, I guess it was Craig Pinkerton came around and was like, "That's not how this is done. You got to do this." And then and basically Pat Summitt backed me. She said, "Let him do the interview now." And then she said, "Now you know how to do this next time." And it was like a stare, like, don't ever try this again.
Such a great person. I'll share my one Pat Summitt story. My wife is not the biggest sports fan in the world, not much of a sports fan at all. And she's been around Philip Fulmer, Lane Kiffin, Derek Dooley. Didn't do anything for her. It could have been the same guy that recently fixed our washer and dryer. It doesn't mean anything to her. She met Pat Summitt. We walked around a corner. My wife talks too much, but she was speechless. Could not shake her hand, could not introduce my daughter. That is the type of person Pat Summitt was. When she walked into a room, the room felt different and it felt more important. So I will go ahead and Meat Drinker says, "You mean you let her around Kiffin?" Well, I was there, so it was just on a football field. Nothing happened, fortunately. That would have been an issue. Hard to cover a guy. I don't know. Maybe it's not. But ultimately with Pat Summitt, I think that presence in recruiting would have won her a couple of the prospects that you mentioned. I really do.